The Messerschmitt Me-109's cannon shells screamed past Captain Jake "Thunder" Morrison's cockpit, close enough that he could smell the cordite through his oxygen mask. The German fighter had materialized out of the morning sun like a gray ghost, its yellow nose spinner glinting as it rolled into another attack run. Morrison's hands moved with practiced precision across the controls of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the massive radial engine responding with a throaty roar that earned the aircraft its fearsome nickname. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high!" Morrison's wingman, Lieutenant Tommy Kowalski, called over the radio, his voice tight with adrenaline. 3 more Me-109s were diving from 20,000 feet, their distinctive angular silhouettes cutting through the crystalline air above the French countryside. Morrison felt the familiar surge of combat focus flooding his system. This was September 15, 1943, and the 56th Fighter Group was escorting B-17 Flying Fortresses deep into German-occupied territory. What had started as a routine mission was about to become a baptism of fire that would prove once and for all whether America's newest fighter could stand against the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots. 6 months earlier, Captain Jake Morrison had stood on the tarmac at RAF Boxted in Essex, England, staring up at the most intimidating fighter aircraft he had ever seen. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt dwarfed every other single-engine fighter on the base, its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine giving it the appearance of a flying bathtub with wings. "She's a beast, isn't she?" Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke approached, his weathered face bearing the marks of a career pilot who had seen combat from the Philippines to Europe. As commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke had the reputation of being one of the finest tacticians in the 8th Air Force. Morrison nodded, still processing the sheer size of the aircraft. At 16,000 pounds fully loaded, the P-47 weighed nearly twice as much as the nimble P-51 Mustangs he had seen at other bases. "Sir, with respect, this thing looks like it should be dropping bombs, not fighting other fighters." Zemke chuckled. "That's what every pilot says when they first see her. But let me tell you something, Morrison. The Thunderbolt isn't built to dance with the enemy. She's built to destroy them. 8.5 caliber machine guns, 3,400 rounds of ammunition, and enough armor plating to stop a freight train. Plus, that R2800 engine produces 2,000 horsepower. When you dive this bird from altitude, nothing in the sky can catch you." The briefing room at Boxted buzzed with nervous energy as 25 pilots from the 61st Fighter Group gathered for their first operational briefing. Morrison looked around at the faces of men who had trained together for months but had never faced combat. There was Lieutenant Tommy Kowalski from Detroit, barely 21 years old, but already showing the keen instincts of a natural pilot. Beside him sat Captain Robert Johnson from Oklahoma, a quiet man whose calm demeanor masked fierce determination.
Major Francis Gabi Gabreski stood at the front of the room, his Polish-American features set in concentration. As squadron commander, Gabreski had the responsibility of turning these eager young pilots into a cohesive fighting unit. He had already completed a combat tour with the RAF's Polish squadron flying Spitfires against the Luftwaffe, and his experience would prove invaluable in the months ahead. "Gentlemen," Gabreski began, his voice carrying the authority of combat experience, "you're about to face the most experienced and skilled fighter pilots in the world. The Luftwaffe has been fighting this war for 4 years, and their best pilots have hundreds of combat missions under their belts. They know every trick, every tactic, every advantage their Me-109s and FW-190s can give them." He pointed to a large chart showing aircraft silhouettes. "The Messerschmitt Me-109G is fast, maneuverable, and deadly. It can outturn us, outclimb us at certain altitudes, and its cannon can punch through our armor if they get a good shot. But here's what they can't do. They can't outdive us, they can't outrun us in level flight above 25,000 feet, and they definitely can't take the punishment we can dish out. Morrison studied the technical specifications displayed on the briefing board. The Me-109G could reach 386 miles per hour in level flight and had a service ceiling of 37,890 feet. Its armament consisted of one 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns mounted in the engine cowling. Some variants carried additional 20mm cannon in underwing pods, making them devastatingly effective against Allied bombers. The key to fighting the 109, Gabreski continued, is to use our advantages while negating theirs. We fight them at high altitude where our turbo-supercharged engines give us the edge. We use our superior firepower to make every burst count. And most importantly, we never try to turn fight them at low altitude. That's suicide. Lieutenant Kowalski raised his hand. Sir, what about pilot experience? I've heard some of these German aces have over 100 kills. Gabreski nodded grimly. That's true. Pilots like Adolf Galland, Werner Molders, and Erich Hartmann are legends in the Luftwaffe. But remember, they're fighting a defensive war now. Every day, more of their experienced pilots are shot down and can't be replaced. We have the luxury of training our pilots thoroughly before sending them into combat. They're throwing teenagers into Me-109s with barely 50 hours of flight time. The reality of their situation was sobering. The 8th Air Force was attempting something never tried in warfare: daylight precision bombing deep into enemy territory without fighter escort for the final legs of the mission. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were suffering horrific casualties, sometimes losing 20% or more of their aircraft on a single mission. Morrison had joined the Army Air Forces after Pearl Harbor, driven by the same patriotic fervor that had swept across America. A college graduate with a degree in engineering, he had the analytical mind that made for an excellent pilot. But technical knowledge was one thing, combat was an entirely other. The training regimen at Boxted was intensive and unforgiving. Dawn to dusk flying exercises, gunnery practice, formation flying, and tactical maneuvering consumed every waking hour. The P-47 was a challenging aircraft to master. Its size and weight required different techniques than the lighter trainers most pilots had flown in flight school. "It's heavy on the controls," Morrison muttered to himself after his first solo flight in the Thunderbolt. The aircraft felt sluggish in turns compared to the nimble AT-6 Texan he had trained on in the States. But when he pushed the throttle forward and felt the massive engine respond, the sensation was intoxicating. The P-47 accelerated like a rocket, and in a dive, it seemed to defy physics. Captain Johnson proved to be one of the most gifted pilots in the squadron. During a training exercise simulating combat with RAF Spitfires, he demonstrated the tactics that would become standard for Thunderbolt operations. When the Spitfire pilot tried to engage in a turning dogfight, Johnson used the P-47's superior speed and diving ability to repeatedly break off, gain altitude, and attack from above. "Altitude is life," Johnson explained to the younger pilots after the exercise. "The Me-109 can outturn us, but if we maintain the energy advantage, we dictate when and how the fight happens." The squadron's first combat mission came on April 8, 1943. Morrison felt his stomach clench as he strapped into his P-47, the familiar pre-combat jitters making his hands shake slightly. The mission was relatively simple: escort B-17s on a raid against aircraft factories in Germany, then break off when the Thunderbolts reached their maximum range.
As the formation of 36 P-47s climbed through the English morning, Morrison marveled at the sight. Each aircraft was a monument to American industrial might, representing hundreds of hours of labor by workers in Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York. The Pratt & Whitney engines alone were mechanical marvels, featuring 2 rows of 9 cylinders each, producing power that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The bombers appeared below them like a vast silver armada, 250 B-17s arranged in tight defensive formations. Each flying fortress bristled with .50 caliber machine guns, creating overlapping fields of fire designed to protect against fighter attacks. But Morrison knew from intelligence reports that German fighter tactics had evolved to counter these defensive measures. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high!" The call from the lead flight shattered the morning calm. Morrison squinted through his canopy and saw them, a formation of Me-109s diving out of the sun, their yellow-nosed spinners marking them as aircraft from Jagdgeschwader, one of the Luftwaffe's most aggressive fighter wings. The German attack was perfectly executed. The Me-109s came down in a shallow dive, their speed allowing them to fire and break away before the American fighters could react. Morrison watched in horror as tracer rounds converged on one of the B-17s in the lead formation. The bomber's No. 2 engine erupted in flames, and the aircraft began to fall behind the formation. "Stay with the bombers," Gabreski's voice cut through the radio chatter. The temptation to pursue the German fighters was overwhelming, but their primary mission was protecting the B-17s, not scoring kills. Morrison forced himself to maintain formation as more Me-109s appeared, attacking the bombers in waves. The German pilots showed remarkable skill and courage, pressing their attacks to point-blank range before breaking away. Several bombers were already trailing smoke and struggling to maintain formation. Then, Morrison saw something that would haunt him for months afterward. An Me-109 with the distinctive markings of a veteran pilot made a head-on attack against a B-17 in the low formation. The German pilot held his course until the last possible second, firing continuously before pulling up and over the bomber. The flying fortress shuddered under the impact of 20mm cannon shells, its nose section disintegrating in a shower of metal and flame. The bomber pitched downward, already out of control, as Morrison watched 9 men bail out into the freezing air at 25,000 feet. 3 parachutes failed to open. The remaining crewmen would face capture by German forces in years in prisoner of war camps, if they survived the landing. By the time the escort mission ended and the P-47s returned to Boxstead, Morrison felt as though he had aged 10 years in a few hours. The squadron had lost 2 aircraft to German fighters, with 1 pilot killed and another captured. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated that reports of their declining effectiveness were greatly exaggerated. 300 miles away, at Luftwaffe base Vitry-en-Artois in occupied France, Hauptmann Klaus Brenner was debriefing his pilots after the same engagement. The 26-year-old fighter ace had just scored his 38th victory, shooting down one of the American P-47s that had been escorting the B-17 formation. Brenner commanded the 2nd Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 26, a unit with a proud history dating back to the early days of the war. His pilots were a mix of combat veterans and relative newcomers, but all were flying the latest variant of Germany's most successful fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me-109 G6. "The Americans are getting better," Brenner observed to his intelligence officer as they reviewed combat reports. "Their formations are tighter and they're not breaking off to chase us when we attack the bombers. Someone is training them properly." The Me-109 G6 that Brenner flew was the result of 4 years of continuous development and combat experience. Powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605A engine producing 1,475 horsepower, it could reach 386 miles per hour in level flight and climb to 37,890 feet. More importantly, it was armed with a devastating 30mm Mk108 cannon firing through the propeller hub, supplemented by 2 13mm MG131 machine guns. Brenner had joined the Luftwaffe in 1939 as a young lieutenant fresh from flight training. He had fought in the Battle of France, the Battle of Britain, and on the Eastern Front before being assigned to defend the Reich against the growing Allied bombing offensive.
His aircraft, marked with a distinctive yellow nose of JG-26, bore the scars of dozens of combat encounters. The hangar at Vitry buzzed with activity, as ground crews worked to repair battle damage and prepare aircraft for the next mission. Brenner watched his mechanics replacing the damaged canopy on his Me-109, where fragments from an American .50 caliber bullet had spiderwebbed the plexiglass. The shot had come from one of the new P-47 Thunderbolts, and only luck had prevented it from being fatal. Herr Hauptmann, Obergefreiter Fritz Weber, Brenner's crew chief, approached with a concerned expression. Weber had been maintaining Me-109s since the beginning of the war, and could diagnose problems that escaped younger mechanics. "The engine is running rough. I think we have cylinder problems again."
The DB605 engine, while powerful, had proven troublesome in service. Cooling problems, bearing failures, and cylinder wear plagued the design, requiring constant maintenance to keep aircraft operational. With spare parts becoming increasingly scarce and quality control suffering in German factories, maintaining a squadron of fighters was becoming a logistical nightmare. Brenner nodded. "Do what you can, Weber. We fly again tomorrow." In the pilot's ready room, Brenner gathered his men for the evening briefing. The faces looking back at him told the story of Germany's declining fortunes in the air war. Veteran pilots like Oberleutnant Heinrich Miller and Feldwebel Anton Richter showed the strain of constant combat, their eyes holding the hollow look of men who had seen too much death. The younger pilots, boys really, some barely out of flight training, tried to mask their fear with bravado. Intelligence reports that the Americans are fielding more of their P-47 Thunderbolts. These aircraft are heavier and less maneuverable than their P-40s and P-39s, but they pack tremendous firepower and can absorb significant damage. They also seem to perform better at high altitude than we initially expected. Lieutenant Hans Kruger, one of the newer pilots, raised his hand. "Herr Hauptmann, how do we best attack these Thunderbolts?" Brenner had been studying this question since the American fighters began appearing in significant numbers. The P-47 is fast in a dive and has good high-altitude performance, but it's sluggish in turns, especially at low altitude. Our best tactic is to attack from above, fire a quick burst, then climb away before they can retaliate. Never try to dogfight with them at their preferred altitude. The reality facing the Luftwaffe was becoming increasingly grim. While German pilots like Brenner possessed superior experience and tactical knowledge, they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For every Me-109 that took off from bases and occupied Europe, the Allies could put 3 or 4 fighters in the air. More critically, when a German pilot was shot down over enemy territory, he was lost forever. Allied pilots who survived being shot down could return to combat within days or weeks. Brenner studied the combat reports from other units, noting disturbing trends. GG2 had lost 4 experienced pilots in the past week, including one Staffel commander with over 60 victories. GG11, defending the approaches to Hamburg, had been reduced to half strength after a series of brutal encounters with American fighter sweeps. The strategic situation was also deteriorating rapidly. The Allies were launching round-the-clock bombing campaigns, with the Americans attacking by day and the British by night. German fighter units were being stretched to the breaking point, forced to operate at maximum intensity without adequate rest or resupply. "Gentlemen," Brenner concluded the briefing, "we face a challenging time ahead. The enemy has more aircraft, more pilots, and seemingly unlimited resources. But we have advantages they cannot match: superior training, combat experience, and the knowledge that we are defending our homeland. Every bomber we stop, every fighter we shoot down protects German cities and German families." After dismissing his pilots, Brenner walked outside into the cool French evening.
The airfield was blacked out, but he could see the silhouettes of Me-109 scattered across the field, each one a potential weapon in the desperate battle for air superiority. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another chance to prove that skill and determination could overcome numerical disadvantage.
Back at RAF Boxted, the American pilots were undergoing their own evolution. The initial encounters with the Luftwaffe had provided valuable lessons about the realities of air combat, and Colonel Zemke was determined to adapt American tactics to maximize the P-47's advantages while minimizing its weaknesses. Morrison found himself increasingly fascinated by the technical aspects of aerial warfare. In the evenings, after completing maintenance and mission planning, he studied German fighter tactics and aircraft performance data. The engineering training he had received before the war served him well as he analyzed the strengths and limitations of both the P-47 and the Me-109. "The key is energy management," he explained to Lieutenant Kowalski during one of their late-night discussions. "The Germans have been fighting this war long enough to understand that altitude equals energy, and energy equals life. They climb to maximum altitude, then dive down to attack. We need to do the same thing, but better." Kowalski, despite his youth, had proven to be an exceptionally gifted pilot with natural instincts that couldn't be taught. His reflexes were lightning fast, and he seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to spot enemy aircraft at extreme distances. But he was also impetuous and eager for combat, traits that could prove fatal in the unforgiving environment of aerial warfare. "I still don't understand why we can't just turn fight with them," Kowalski said, frustration evident in his voice. "The P-47 has 8 guns compared to their 3. If we could just get them in a turning battle." Morrison shook his head. "That's exactly what they want us to do. The Me-109 has a much lower wing loading than we do. They can outturn us all day long. But look at these numbers." He pointed to performance charts spread across the table. "Above 25,000 feet, we're faster in level flight. In a dive from altitude, nothing can catch us, and our service ceiling is higher than theirs." The P-47D Thunderbolt was indeed an impressive machine when viewed through the lens of engineering specifications. Its R2800-21 engine featured a sophisticated turbo supercharger system that maintained power output at extreme altitudes. While the Me-109's engine began to lose power above 30,000 feet, the P-47 could maintain full performance up to 40,000 feet or higher. Captain Johnson had become the squadron's unofficial tactical expert, spending hours developing new attack formations and combat procedures. His calm, analytical approach to air combat complemented his natural flying ability, making him one of the most effective pilots in the group. "We need to think of the P-47 as a heavyweight boxer," he explained during a squadron meeting. "We don't dance around the ring, we wait for our moment, then deliver a knockout punch. Every attack should be planned and executed with maximum impact." The American approach to pilot training was also proving advantageous in the long term. While German pilots often entered combat with superior flying skills, American pilots received extensive training in gunnery, formation flying, and tactical procedures. More importantly, the United States had a seemingly unlimited supply of potential pilots, allowing the Army Air Forces to maintain high training standards even as casualties mounted. Major Gabreski had implemented an innovative training program that paired experienced pilots with newcomers, creating a mentorship system that accelerated learning while reducing combat losses. Morrison found himself assigned as mentor to Second Lieutenant David Ace Patterson, a 20-year-old pilot from Texas who had graduated flight training with the highest marks in his class. Patterson embodied the enthusiasm and confidence of American youth, but he also possessed a sharp intelligence and eagerness to learn that impressed his older colleagues. During practice missions, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of air combat tactics that suggested he would become an exceptional fighter pilot. "The trick to deflection shooting," he explained as they walked around Patterson's P-47 during pre-flight inspection, "is to think three-dimensionally. You're not shooting at where the target is, you're shooting at where it's going to be. The bullets take time to travel, and the target is constantly moving." The 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns mounted in the P-47's wings were devastating weapons when properly employed.
Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of fire of 6,400 rounds per minute when all 8 guns fired simultaneously. The 50 caliber round was large enough to damage critical aircraft systems and had sufficient range to engage targets at distances beyond the effective range of German cannon.
But ammunition capacity was limited. Each gun carried approximately 425 rounds, providing about 30 seconds of continuous firing. This meant that every burst had to count, requiring precise gunnery skills and careful ammunition management during extended engagements. The squadron's gunnery training took place over the Wash, a large bay on England's east coast where pilots could practice aerial gunnery against towed targets without endangering civilian populations. Morrison watched Patterson's first gunnery exercise with mixed emotions. The young pilot's natural ability was evident, but he also displayed the impatience that characterized many rookie pilots. "You're firing 2 long bursts," Morrison observed after Patterson's first pass at the target. "Short bursts, 2 or 3 seconds maximum. Let the guns cool between attacks and make every bullet count." The P-47's gun sight was a sophisticated instrument that helped pilots calculate the proper lead angle for deflection shots. The N9 optical sight projected a ring of light onto a combining glass, allowing pilots to frame targets while maintaining visibility of the surrounding airspace. Mastering the sight required hundreds of hours of practice and an intuitive understanding of relative motion in 3 dimensions. As spring turned to summer, the 56th Fighter Group began flying deeper penetration missions, escorting bombers to targets in Germany itself. The encounters with the Luftwaffe became more frequent and more intense as German fighter units concentrated their efforts on stopping the daylight bombing campaign. Morrison's first confirmed victory came on June 26, 1943, during a mission to escort B-24 Liberators attacking aircraft factories near Bremen. The engagement began when a formation of Me-109s from JG-26 attacked the bomber formation head-on, attempting to break up the defensive formation before making individual attacks on straggling aircraft. Morrison was flying as element leader in the high squadron when he spotted the German fighters approaching from 12 o'clock high. The Me-109s were in perfect formation, their yellow nose spinners glinting in the morning sun as they dove toward the bombers with deadly precision. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, diving on the lead box," Morrison called over the radio, pushing his throttle forward to intercept the German fighters. The engagement that followed lasted less than 3 minutes, but demonstrated the evolving nature of air combat over Europe. The German pilots showed exceptional skill and courage, pressing their attacks despite heavy defensive fire from the bombers and the presence of American escort fighters. But the P-47 pilots had learned to use their aircraft's advantages effectively, turning what might have been a massacre of the bomber formation into a series of individual dogfights. Morrison found himself in a head-on pass with a Me-109 piloted by an obviously experienced German pilot. The enemy fighter's camouflage scheme and victory markings identified it as the aircraft of a seasoned ace, someone who had survived dozens of similar encounters. For a split second, Morrison could see the German pilot's face through his canopy. Young, determined, and completely focused on the task of destroying American bombers. The two fighters closed at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour. Morrison waited until the last possible moment, then squeezed the trigger on his control stick. All 8 .5 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously, creating a cone of destruction that intersected the Me-109's flight path. The German aircraft shuddered under the impact of multiple hits, its engine beginning to smoke as the pilot pulled up and rolled away from the engagement. Morrison followed, using the P-47's superior diving speed to close the distance. The Me-109 pilot was good, very good, pulling into a tight climbing turn that would have been impossible for most aircraft to follow. But Morrison had learned his lessons well. Instead of trying to turn with the German fighter, he used his speed advantage to climb above and behind his opponent.
The second attack was decisive. Morrison fired a 3-second burst from directly behind the Me-109, watching his tracers converge on the enemy fighter's fuselage and engine compartment. The German aircraft rolled inverted and began a steep dive toward the earth below, trailing smoke and flame. Morrison never saw a parachute. The victory over Bremen marked a turning point for Morrison and the entire 56th Fighter Group. Word of their success spread through the 8th Air Force, establishing the Wolf Pack, as the 56th came to be known, as one of the premier fighter organizations in Europe. But success came at a price, and the Luftwaffe was quick to adapt to American tactics. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner studied the intelligence reports from the Bremen engagement with growing concern. The Americans were learning quickly, abandoning the rigid formations and inflexible tactics that had characterized their early missions. More troubling, the P-47 Thunderbolt was proving to be a far more capable fighter than initial assessments had suggested. "They're fighting like veterans," Brenner observed to his wingman, Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller, as they prepared for another intercept mission. "Someone is teaching them proper energy management and formation tactics." Müller nodded grimly. The 24-year-old pilot had 43 victories to his credit, making him one of the most successful pilots in JG-26. But the strain of constant combat was beginning to show. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his parachute harness, and dark circles under his eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights. "The P-47s are getting more aggressive, too," Müller added. "They're not just escorting bombers anymore. They're coming down to fight us on our own terms." This was perhaps the most significant development in the air war over Europe. American fighter tactics were evolving from purely defensive escort missions to offensive fighter sweeps designed to seek out and destroy German fighters wherever they could be found. The P-47's rugged construction and heavy firepower made it ideally suited for this type of aggressive combat. At RAF Bachstedt, Colonel Zemke was implementing new tactical doctrines based on combat experience and intelligence reports about German fighter capabilities. The Zemke fan formation spread American fighters across a wide area, making it difficult for German controllers to determine the strength and intentions of incoming raids. More importantly, it allowed individual flight leaders to respond quickly to developing tactical situations. Morrison found himself promoted to flight leader, responsible for 3 other pilots, including Lieutenant Kowalski and Second Lieutenant Patterson. The additional responsibility weighed heavily on him, knowing that his tactical decisions could mean the difference between life and death for the men under his command. "Leadership in combat is different from leadership in peacetime," Major Gabreski explained during a commander's meeting. "You have to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, often while someone is shooting at you. The key is to train your subordinates so well that they can anticipate your intentions and react accordingly." The new tactics were put to the test during a fighter sweep over the Netherlands on July 17, 1943. The mission was designed as a provocation. 36 P-47s flying at medium altitude over known German fighter bases, hoping to draw the Luftwaffe into combat under conditions favorable to the American fighters. Morrison led his flight of 4 P-47s as part of the high squadron, maintaining altitude at 28,000 feet, while the lower squadrons flew stepped down at 26,000 and 24,000 feet. The formation created overlapping fields of fire and mutual support while maintaining the altitude advantage that was crucial for successful P-47 operations. The German response came exactly as predicted. Radar stations along the Dutch coast detected the incoming American formation and vectored 2 Stoffels of Me-109s from JG-26 to intercept. The German fighters climbed to maximum altitude, hoping to achieve the energy advantage that had served them well in previous encounters. But this time, the Americans were ready for them. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high, climbing!" The call came from Lieutenant Kowalski, whose exceptional eyesight had spotted the German fighters while they were still 10 miles away. Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he spotted the climbing Me-109s. There were 12 of them in perfect formation, their camouflaged wings catching the morning sunlight as they struggled to reach intercepting altitude. The lead aircraft bore the distinctive markings of JG-26, and Morrison realized he was probably facing some of the most experienced pilots in the Luftwaffe. "Wolf back later to all flights," came Colonel Zemka's voice over the radio. "We have the altitude advantage. Execute Tactic 7 on my signal." Tactic 7 was one of several pre-planned engagement scenarios developed by the 56th Fighter Group's tacticians. It called for the high squadron to maintain altitude while lower squadrons initiated the attack, drawing German fighters into turning engagements where the P-47's superior firepower could be brought to bear. Morrison watched as the engagement developed below him. Captain Johnson's flight dove on the climbing Me-109s, forcing the German formation to break and defend itself. The German pilots reacted with practiced precision, splitting into elements and using their superior maneuverability to avoid the American attack. But the Americans had learned from previous encounters. Instead of being drawn into turning battles, the P-47 pilots maintained their speed advantage, making high-speed passes and climbing away before the Me-109s could respond effectively. The German fighters found themselves caught in a deadly trap. If they climbed to pursue the retreating P-47s, they sacrificed their maneuverability advantage. But if they remained at low altitude, they became sitting ducks for follow-up attacks. "Thunderflight, this is Thunder Leader," Morrison called to his wingmen. "We're going down. Kowalski, take the element and cover our exit." Morrison pushed his P-47 into a shallow dive, building speed as he approached the swirling dogfight below. He selected an Me-109 that had become separated from its wingman during the initial encounter, noting the aircraft's yellow-nose spinner and the small victory marks painted on its fuselage. The German pilot was good, exceptionally good. As Morrison closed to firing range, the Me-109 suddenly snapped into a vertical climb, trying to force the heavier P-47 into a stall. But Morrison had anticipated this move, maintaining his speed and climbing past the German fighter before rolling inverted and diving back into the attack. The second pass was successful. Morrison fired a 4-second burst from close range, watching his tracers converge on the Me-109's engine compartment. The German fighter shuddered under the impact of multiple 50-caliber hits, its engine beginning to stream white smoke as the pilot struggled to maintain control. The Me-109 rolled inverted and entered a steep dive, trying to escape to lower altitude where its superior maneuverability might provide an advantage. But Morrison stayed with him, using the P-47's excellent diving characteristics to maintain contact. At 15,000 feet, the German pilot pulled out of his dive and attempted a desperate climbing turn. It was his final mistake. Morrison fired one more burst, and the Me-109's engine exploded in a shower of flame and debris. The aircraft pitched forward into an uncontrolled dive, its pilot either dead or unconscious at the controls. Morrison circled once, looking for a parachute, but saw none. The engagement ended as quickly as it had begun. The remaining Me-109s, finding themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered, broke off the attack and dove for the deck, using their superior low-altitude performance to escape the pursuing P-47s. Morrison watched them disappear into the haze over the Dutch countryside, knowing that this victory had come at the cost of revealing new American tactics to the enemy. 300 miles away, Hauptmann Klaus Brenner was receiving reports from the surviving pilots of his Staffel. 2 Me-109s had been shot down, including one piloted by Oberleutnant Heinrich Miller, his most experienced wingman. The loss hit Brenner particularly hard. Miller had been like a younger brother to him, and his 43 victories represented irreplaceable combat experience.
"The Americans are changing their tactics," reported Lieutenant Hans Kruger, one of the few pilots to return from the engagement. "They're not falling for our climbing attacks anymore. They maintain altitude discipline and use coordinated attacks to overwhelm individual aircraft." Brenner studied the combat reports with growing unease. The Luftwaffe's traditional advantages, superior pilot training, better aircraft performance at certain altitudes, and tactical experience, were being systematically negated by American numerical superiority and evolving tactics. More troubling,
Replacement pilots arriving at JG-26 had barely 50 hours of flight time, compared to the hundreds of hours that had been standard earlier in the war. "We need to adapt," Brenner told his pilots during the evening briefing. "The Americans have learned to fight at high altitude, where their P-47s perform best. We must force them down to lower altitudes where our Me-109s have the advantage." The new German tactics involved feint attacks designed to draw American fighters away from the bomber formations, then ambushing them at lower altitudes where the Me-109's superior maneuverability could be brought to bear. It was a desperate strategy that relied on splitting American formations and defeating them piecemeal. By September 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a new level of intensity. Both sides were throwing everything they had into the daylight bombing campaign, with massive formations of B-17s and B-24s striking deep into Germany, while equally massive formations of fighters battled for control of the skies. Morrison had been promoted to major and given command of a full squadron, replacing Major Gabreski, who had been shot down and captured during a mission over France. The responsibility weighed heavily on him as he prepared for what intelligence suggested would be one of the largest air battles of the war. "Today's target is Schweinfurt," Colonel Zemke announced during the mission briefing. "Ball-bearing factories that are critical to the German war effort. Intelligence estimates will face upwards of 300 enemy fighters from bases across Germany and occupied Europe." The numbers were sobering. The 8th Air Force was launching 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses protected by every available P-47 in England, nearly 200 fighters. But the Thunderbolts could only escort the bombers part way to the target before running low on fuel and being forced to turn back. The final leg of the mission would be unescorted, leaving the bombers vulnerable to concentrated fighter attacks. Morrison looked around the briefing room at the faces of pilots who had become like brothers to him over the past months. Lieutenant Kowalski, now a captain and flight leader, had matured into one of the finest fighter pilots in the 8th Air Force. Second Lieutenant Patterson had proven himself in combat, shooting down 3 German fighters and earning the nickname Ace through skill rather than luck. Morrison told his pilots, "Our job is simple. We escort the bombers as far as our fuel allows, then we come home and get ready to meet them on the return leg. Every German fighter we shoot down on the way in is one less fighter the bombers have to face over the target." The morning of September 14th dawned clear and cold over England. Morrison performed his pre-flight inspection of his P-47 with special care, knowing that mechanical failure during combat could be fatal. His aircraft, nicknamed Thunder's Roar, bore the scars of numerous combat encounters, patched bullet holes, replaced panels, and a new canopy where German cannon fire had shattered the original. The takeoff was impressive and sobering. Nearly 600 aircraft rose from bases across England, forming the largest aerial armada ever assembled. The B-17s formed up in combat boxes, each group of bombers creating overlapping fields of defensive fire. Above and around them, the P-47s took their positions, silver fighters gleaming in the morning sun. As the formation crossed the English Channel, Morrison thought about the men in the bombers below. Each B-17 carried 10 crewmen, young Americans who had volunteered to fly the most dangerous missions of the war. Statistics showed that bomber crews only had a 25% chance of surviving a full tour of duty, yet they continued to volunteer, driven by the same sense of duty that had brought Morrison to this cockpit.
The German response began as soon as the formation crossed into occupied airspace. Small groups of Me-109s and FW-190s appeared at the edges of radar range, shadowing the bombers and radioing position reports to fighter control centers across the Reich. Morrison knew that somewhere ahead, hundreds of German fighters were taking off from dozens of airfields, climbing to intercept altitude and preparing for the largest air battle they had ever fought. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high!" The call came from Captain Johnson, leading the forward escort squadron. Morrison looked up and saw them,
a formation of at least 50 Me-109s in perfect formation, climbing to attack altitude. Behind them, more formations were visible as dots against the sky. "This is it, gentlemen," Morrison called to his squadron. "Remember your training, watch your fuel, and let's bring everyone home." The engagement that followed would later be called the Second Battle of Schweinfurt, but for the men fighting it, it was simply controlled chaos at 25,000 feet. German fighters attacked in waves, using every tactic they had developed over 4 years of war. Me-109s dove from above, while FW-190s attacked from the flanks. Twin-engine Me-410s stood off at long range, firing rockets into the bomber formations. Morrison found himself in the center of the largest dogfight he had ever experienced. Me-109 seemed to be everywhere, their yellow nose spinners flashing as they rolled through the American formation. The radio was a constant chatter of warnings, position reports, and calls for assistance. "Thunder Leader, you've got 2 on your 6. Kowalski's voice cut through the static. Morrison hauled back on his stick, feeling the P-47 climb like an express elevator. The pursuing Me-109s tried to follow, but their engines began to lose power in the thin air above 30,000 feet. Morrison rolled inverted and dove back into the fight, using his altitude advantage to select targets. Below him, the bomber formations were under sustained attack. B-17s were falling out of formation, some trailing smoke, others spinning earthward with dead engines or wounded crews. The sight filled Morrison with cold fury. Each falling bomber represented 10 American lives and months of training and preparation. He selected an Me-109 that was making a beam attack on the lead bomber formation. The German pilot was good, holding his aircraft in a perfect deflection shot as he closed on a B-17 named Memphis Belle. Morrison dove to intercept, building speed as he closed the distance. The German pilot spotted him at the last moment, breaking off his attack on the bomber and pulling into a climbing turn. Morrison fired a short burst, watching his tracers converge on the Me-109's wing route. The German fighter shuddered under the impact, then rolled inverted and dove toward the earth. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Me-109 was attacking from Morrison's blind spot, its cannon shells passing close enough to his cockpit that he could hear them over the engine noise. He rolled right and dove, using the P-47's superior diving speed to escape, then climbed back to altitude to continue the fight. The battle raged for 30 minutes before fuel considerations forced the P-47s to break off and head for home. Morrison took one last look at the bomber formations, now ragged and depleted, but still pressing on toward their target. 60 B-17s had been shot down during the escort phase alone, but the survivors continued their mission with the same determination that had brought them across an ocean to fight. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner climbed out of his Me-109 with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. His aircraft had taken multiple hits from American .50 caliber machine guns, and only the skill of his ground crew had kept it flying. Around him, the airfield at Vitry was a scene of controlled chaos as mechanics worked frantically to repair damaged fighters and prepare them for the next phase of the battle.
"How many?" he asked his intelligence officer. 15 confirmed destroyed, 8 probables, came the reply. But we lost 12 aircraft and 7 pilots. The numbers told a sobering story. While the Luftwaffe had inflicted heavy casualties on the American bomber formations, they had lost irreplaceable pilots and aircraft in the process. Each German fighter pilot shot down represented months of training and combat experience that could never be replaced. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed to have an unlimited supply of both aircraft and pilots. Brenner walked to the dispersal area where his surviving pilots were being debriefed. The faces looking back at him showed the strain of continuous combat. Lieutenant Kruger sported a bandaged head where plexiglass fragments had cut him during a close encounter with a P-47. Feldwebel Richter's aircraft was so badly damaged that it would require a complete engine change. "The P-47s are getting better," reported Oberfeldwebel Wilhelm Schmidt, one of Brenner's most experienced pilots.
They're not making the same mistakes they made 6 months ago. Their formation discipline is excellent, and they're using coordinated attacks that are very difficult to counter. As afternoon turned to evening, radar stations began reporting the return of the American bomber formations. The surviving B-17s were limping home after successfully bombing their targets, but they were low on fuel, low on ammunition, and many carried wounded crew members. This was the Luftwaffe's last chance to inflict maximum casualties before the Americans reached the safety of their escort fighters. Brenner climbed into his patched and repaired Me-109 for the second time that day, knowing that many of his pilots were flying aircraft that should have been grounded for major repairs. But this was total war, and every available fighter had to be thrown into the battle. The interception took place over the Dutch coast as the American bombers struggled toward England. Morrison's P-47s had been refueled and rearmed, and they climbed to meet the returning bombers with fresh determination. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking. Scattered formations of shot-up B-17s, many with engines shut down, and others barely maintaining altitude. "Jesus," whispered Lieutenant Patterson over the radio. "Look at them." Morrison counted fewer than 200 bombers in the returning formations, meaning that nearly half of the original force had been lost or so badly damaged that they couldn't make it home. But the survivors were still flying, still fighting, their gunners ready to defend against the inevitable German attacks. The German fighters appeared right on schedule, climbing from bases in Holland and Belgium to make one final assault on the battered bomber formations. Morrison led his squadron down to meet them, determined that not one more American bomber would be lost on his watch. The final engagement took place at 20,000 feet over the Zuiderzee. Morrison found himself in a head-on pass with the Me-109 bearing the distinctive markings of JG-26. As the two fighters closed at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour, Morrison realized he was facing Hauptmann Klaus Brenner himself. For a split second, the two pilots looked directly at each other through their respective canopies. Morrison saw a young man, not much older than himself, his face set in concentration behind his oxygen mask. Brenner saw an American pilot who represented everything his country was fighting against: unlimited industrial capacity, fresh replacement pilots, and the slowly grinding inevitability of numerical superiority. Both pilots fired simultaneously. Morrison felt his P-47 shudder as 20mm cannon shells punched through his starboard wing, but his 850 caliber machine guns were also finding their target. Brenner's Me-109 staggered under the impact of multiple hits, white smoke beginning to stream from its engine compartment. The two fighters passed each other with inches to spare, then pulled into opposite turns. Morrison's P-47 was still flying, though the damage to his wing made the controls heavy and unresponsive. Brenner's Me-109 was trailing smoke, but the engine was still running. What followed was a classic one-on-one dogfight between two evenly matched opponents flying aircraft that represented the pinnacle of their respective nations' engineering capabilities. Morrison used the P-47's superior high-altitude performance and diving speed, while Brenner relied on the Me-109's better maneuverability and climbing ability.
For 5 minutes, the two fighters danced around each other in a deadly ballet. Morrison would climb and dive, trying to use his speed advantage to get into firing position. Brenner would turn and climb, using his aircraft's superior agility to avoid the Americans' attacks while looking for an opportunity to counter. The decisive moment came when Brenner, running low on fuel and ammunition, attempted one final attack. He pulled his Me-109 into a steep climbing turn, trying to get behind Morrison's P-47. but the German fighters stalled at the top of the climb, hanging motionless for a split second with its nose pointed at the sky. Morrison didn't hesitate. He rolled inverted and dove, placing his gun sight directly on the stalled Me-109. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, he saw something that made him pause. Brenner was looking directly at him, and the German pilot slowly raised his hand in what might have been a salute. Instead of firing, Morrison pulled up and flew formation with the German fighter for a few seconds. Both pilots looked at each other across the narrow gap between their aircraft. Two young men caught in a war neither had started. Then Brenner nodded once and rolled his damaged Me-109 toward the east, heading for home. Morrison watched him go, then turned his own damaged P-47 toward England and the setting sun. The cost of the Second Battle of Schweinfurt was enormous for both sides. The 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s in their crews, while the Luftwaffe lost 45 fighters and 31 pilots. But the strategic impact was even more significant. The American bombers had successfully destroyed critical ball-bearing factories, while the German fighter force had suffered losses it could not replace. Morrison landed his damaged P-47 at RAF Boxstead as darkness fell over England. The aircraft was so badly shot up that it would never fly again, but it had brought him home one more time. As he climbed out of the cockpit, he was greeted by Colonel Zemke and the other surviving pilots of the 56th Fighter Group. "How many?" Morrison asked, dreading the answer. "We lost 8 aircraft and 5 pilots," Zemke replied. "But we shot down 23 German fighters and probably saved dozens of bombers." The numbers, Morrison realized, told the story of the entire air war. The Americans were winning through sheer attrition, replacing their losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. But each number represented a friend, a fellow pilot who wouldn't be coming home. Over the following weeks, intelligence reports confirmed what many had suspected. The Luftwaffe was beginning to crack under the sustained pressure of the daylight bombing campaign. Experienced pilots like Klaus Brenner were being replaced by teenagers with minimal training. Aircraft production was falling behind demand, and fuel shortages were limiting training and operations. Morrison received word that he was being rotated back to the United States for a well-deserved rest and a new assignment training fighter pilots. As he packed his belongings at Boxstead, he reflected on the months of combat that had transformed him from an eager young pilot into a seasoned combat veteran. Lieutenant Kowalski, now a major and Morrison's replacement as squadron commander, stopped by to say goodbye. The young pilot from Detroit had grown into one of the finest fighter leaders in the 8th Air Force, his natural flying ability honed by months of combat experience. "Think we'll win?" Kowalski asked as they shared a final drink in the officers' club. Morrison looked out the window at the P-47s lined up on the flight line, each one a symbol of American industrial might and determination. "We're already winning. It's just a matter of how long it takes the other side to realize it." Captain Jake Morrison returned to the United States in November 1943, but his war was far from over. He spent the next year training new fighter pilots, passing on the hard-won lessons of air combat to the next generation of American aviators. His students would go on to fly P-47s and P-51s in the final campaigns of the war, carrying forward the tactical innovations developed over the skies of Europe. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner survived the war, though JG-26 was virtually destroyed in the final months of fighting. In a strange twist of fate, he and Morrison met again in 1947 at an aviation conference in Switzerland. The two former enemies found they had more in common than either had expected, sharing a love of flying and a deep respect for the men who had fought on both sides of the conflict.
The P-47 Thunderbolt continued to evolve throughout the war, eventually becoming one of the most successful fighter bombers ever built. Its rugged construction and devastating firepower made it ideally suited for ground attack missions, and by war's end, P-47s had destroyed more enemy aircraft and ground targets than any other American fighter. But perhaps the most important legacy of the men who flew the Thunderbolt was the demonstration that courage, determination, and proper training could overcome any technological or numerical disadvantage. The young Americans who climbed into those massive fighters had transformed themselves from civilian pilots into the finest Air Force the world had ever seen. As Morrison stood on the deck of the transport ship carrying him back to America, watching the English coastline fade into the distance, he thought about the friends he was leaving behind and the battles yet to be fought. The war would continue for another year and a half, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. American industry and American courage had proven themselves in the crucible of combat. The thunder over Europe was finally beginning to fade, but its echoes would be heard for generations to come. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through one of aviation history's most dramatic chapters. If this story of courage, determination, and the men who flew the mighty P-47 Thunderbolt has captured your imagination, I'd be grateful if you'd show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with fellow aviation enthusiasts. Creating these detailed, historically accurate narratives requires extensive research and countless hours of writing to bring you the most engaging content possible. Your support means everything to me and helps me continue producing these epic stories that bring aviation history to life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest aviation adventures. From the Pacific Theater to the European skies, from legendary dogfights to untold stories of heroism, there's so much more to explore together. What would you like to hear next? The story of the Tuskegee Airmen and their P-51 Mustangs? The incredible tale of the Doolittle Raid? Or perhaps the Pacific War adventures of F-4U Corsair pilots? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies and remember the brave men and women who fought for freedom in the air. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.